I worked as a night receptionist at the Crestwood Motel. My first shift. The air hung thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and something else, something indefinably musty, clinging to the worn carpet like a second skin. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, their pale glow reflecting off the chipped formica countertop. Outside, the crickets chirped a relentless summer symphony, a stark contrast to the unsettling quiet within the aging building. I was fresh out of college, armed with a degree in history and a desperate need for a job. The Crestwood, with its peeling paint and slightly sinister reputation, was the only place that hired without demanding experience. My training consisted of a 15-minute rundown from a weary-eyed woman named Agnes who smelled faintly of lavender and desperation. "Just answer the phone, hand out keys, and try not to get murdered," she'd said, a grim smile playing on her lips. The night crawled by slowly at first. A few bored travelers checked in, their voices muffled by the thickness of the phone receiver. I fumbled with the ancient switchboard, its wires a chaotic tangle beneath the desk. I felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that was less about the job itself and more about the building's oppressive atmosphere. It felt watched. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence, startling me. "Crestwood Motel," I answered, my voice slightly shaky. "Room 13. A raspy voice replied. "Need more towels?" "Room 13. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Agnes's warning echoed in my mind. I knew, even before I'd properly started, that room 13 was off limits. It had been sealed shut for years, ever since the incident. "I'm sorry," I stammered, trying to sound professional despite the tremor in my voice. "Room 13, that room is unavailable." "What? I'm already here. Need towels." "Now." The voice was sharper this time, tinged with impatience, almost anger. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to picture the caller. A disgruntled guest? A prankster? Or something else? Hesitantly, I consulted the guest log. No one was registered in room 13. Agnes hadn't mentioned any exceptions. My unease morphed into full-blown terror. "Sir," I said, trying to sound authoritative, "there's been a misunderstanding. Room 13 is out of service." The line went silent. I held my breath, waiting for a response, any response. Then a click. The line went dead. My gut screamed at me to ignore it, to just forget about the call and focus on the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. But I couldn't. Something about that voice, that insistent demand for towels, chilled me to the bone. I grabbed the master key, my hand trembling. Room 13 was at the far end of the motel, a long and dimly lit corridor away. Each step echoed unnervingly in the silence. The old wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound amplifying the dread building in my chest. Reaching room 13, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. The number was barely visible, the paint chipped and faded. Taking a deep breath, I inserted the key and slowly turned. The door swung open with a groan, revealing darkness within. The air inside was thick, heavy with the same musty scent I'd smelled at the reception, only intensified 100-fold. It was a scent of decay, of something long dead. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand clammy. The bulb flickered, then sputtered into life, casting a weak, sickly yellow light across the room. My breath caught in my throat. The phone lay off the hook, the receiver dangling precariously. And from the bathroom, I could hear the steady sound of running water. The shower was on. I crept towards the bathroom, my heart pounding like a drum solo. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a stream of water cascading down the shower walls. I pushed the door open further, my eyes scanning the small space. The shower was running, yes, but there was no one there. No towels, no clothes, nothing to indicate any recent occupancy. I turned off the shower, the silence that followed amplifying the eerie quiet of the room. It felt wrong. Intrusive. I spent the rest of my shift in a state of heightened anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something, or someone, was present in the motel, lurking in the shadows. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window panes, sent shivers down my spine. When Agnes arrived to relieve me, I recounted the entire incident, my voice trembling. She listened with a grim expression, her eyes reflecting the same fear that I felt deep down. "Room 13," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the motel's ancient refrigerator. "They say it still remembers." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. I knew then that my first night at the Crestwood Motel was far from over, and my experience with Room 13 was just the beginning of something far more unsettling. The feeling of being watched lingered, the musty scent clinging to my clothes, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions and the chilling mystery of the Crestwood Motel and its haunted Room 13. The next few nights were a blur of increasingly strange occurrences. Whispers in the corridors, flickering lights, and the recurring scent of lavender and decay. I started to see things in the periphery, fleeting shadows that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was not just working at a creepy motel, but unraveling a darker, more sinister truth. The truth about Room 13, and the spirit that still lingered within its walls. One night, a week after my initial encounter, I received another call. It was from Room 13. This time, there was no request for towels. Instead, a chilling voice whispered my name. Then, the line went dead. I didn't hesitate this time. I quit my job at the Crestwood Motel the next day. That night, I moved out and never looked back. But even now, years later, I still hear those whispers in the silence. I started my job at a shipping warehouse, unloading boxes late at night. The place was huge, with tall shelves that seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with all sorts of packages and parcels. The only sounds that filled the air were the distant hum of machinery and the occasional beep of a forklift. One night, as I was working, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure walking between the aisles. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but there was nothing there. I shrugged it off and continued working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the night went on, I noticed something strange. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from one of the aisles to a locked freezer unit that had been sealed shut for over a decade. I couldn't explain where the water was coming from, or why there would be footprints leading to a sealed freezer unit. I decided to investigate further. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way over to the freezer unit. As I approached, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about whether or not I should go inside. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open. The freezer was dark and cold, and I could barely see anything. I shined my flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. There, in the corner, was a figure huddled up against the wall. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but it seemed to be shivering and shaking. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized that the figure was a man, dressed in ragged clothes and covered in dirt and grime. He looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "Please," he whispered, his voice thin and weak. "Help me." I was shocked and confused. How had this man gotten into the freezer, and why had he been here for so long? I helped him to his feet and led him out of the freezer, my mind racing with questions. The man told me his story. He had been working at the warehouse when he accidentally stumbled upon some sensitive information that his boss wanted to keep hidden. In retaliation, they had locked him in the freezer and left him to die. But he had managed to survive, thanks to a small stream of water that had been leaking into the freezer from a nearby pipe. He had been living off of scraps of food that he had managed to scavenge from the warehouse, and he had been too scared to try to escape. I was horrified by the man's story, and I knew that I had to help him. I snuck him out of the warehouse and took him to a nearby hospital, where he received the medical attention that he needed. The police were called, and an investigation was launched into the warehouse and the man's disappearance. It turned out that the warehouse owner had been involved in all sorts of illegal activities, including smuggling and theft. He was arrested and charged with a number of crimes, and the warehouse was shut down. As for the man, he was able to recover physicality, but the psychological scars would take longer to heal. He was grateful for my help, and we stayed in touch over the years. I was glad to have been able to make a difference in his life, and I knew that I had done the right thing by helping him. In the end, my late-night shift at the shipping warehouse turned out to be much more than just a regular job. It was a moment that changed my life forever, and a reminder of the importance of looking out for others, even when it's not easy or convenient. My first day at a funeral home required helping with body preparation. That's what Mr. Silas, the owner, a man whose handshake felt like gripping a cold, damp sponge, had explicitly stated. I'd swallowed my apprehension, the initial wave of nausea at the thought, and nodded, my voice a shaky whisper of agreement. I needed the job. Rent was due, and my ramen budget was critically low. The funeral home, Oakhaven Memorial, was an imposing Victorian structure, all dark wood and stained glass windows depicting scenes of, well, I wasn't sure what exactly, but it definitely wasn't rainbows and kittens. The air inside smelled faintly of formaldehyde and lilies, a peculiar combination that clung to the back of my throat like a persistent cough. Mr. Silas, his eyes like chips of obsidian, had shown me the embalming room. It was a sterile space, dominated by a stainless steel table, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Various instruments, scalpels, needles, drainage tubes, were laid out on a trolley, their gleam reflecting the harsh light. They looked less like tools and more like sinister props from a macabre play. My task for the morning was straightforward, if unnerving, cleaning the instruments after the embalming process. Mr. Silas, his instructions clipped and economical, had demonstrated the procedure, his movements precise and practiced. He then left me alone, the silence of the room amplifying the nervous tremor in my hands as I began the task. The stainless steel gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the instruments back at me with almost mocking clarity. I scrubbed meticulously, the antiseptic soap stinging my skin, each instrument a cold, hard weight in my hands. The air hung heavy, thick with the lingering scent of formaldehyde. As I worked, a low hum emanated from the building's ancient electrical system, a constant, almost imperceptible thrum. Then, the lights flickered. A sudden, sharp dip in illumination plunged the room into near darkness, before sputtering back to life. The brief blackout felt disorienting, unnerving. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd put down the scalpel, its sharp point glinting menacingly even in the dim light, and reached for the next tool. In that moment of darkness, I had sensed movement. A fleeting shadow, a peripheral glimpse of something tall and dark, moving behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. The stainless steel table, the trolley, the walls, all were devoid of anything other than the sterile equipment. Nothing out of place. Except my tools were rearranged. The scalpel, which I distinctly remembered placing on the far right side of the trolley, now lay nestled amongst the forceps. The orderly arrangement of instruments was meticulously disrupted. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a gasp. I hadn't heard a sound, seen anyone enter or leave. The door remained closed, its heavy oak frame undisturbed. The only explanation, illogical, absurd, yet utterly present, was that something or someone had been in the room with me. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous activity. Mr. Silas remained silent, his obsidian eyes seeming to follow my every move. He didn't mention the incident, didn't seem surprised by my increasingly jittery movements, or the tremor in my hands. It was as if he expected something like this. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found myself checking my reflection in every polished surface, expecting to see something behind me. Shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, every creak and groan of the old house sending shivers down my spine. The following days were similar. The flickering lights became a recurring event, accompanied by the unsettling feeling of unseen presence. The tools would occasionally be rearranged, sometimes subtly, sometimes in more pronounced disorder. My senses were constantly on high alert, anticipating the next unsettling occurrence. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, I told myself. Sleep deprivation. An overactive imagination. But a deep, primal fear gnawed at me, refusing to be silenced. One afternoon, while cleaning the embalming table, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible scent, something musky, earthy, and faintly metallic. It wasn't the antiseptic or the formaldehyde. It was different, older, a smell that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the building. As I inhaled it, a chilling vision flashed through my mind, a shadowy figure, its form indistinct yet undeniably malevolent, standing in this very room, its eyes burning with an eerie cold light. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me trembling. I realized then that the movements, the rearranged tools, the flickering lights, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was communicating. Driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, I started researching the history of Oak Haven Memorial. I discovered that the building had been erected in the late 19th century and had served as a hospital before its conversion into a funeral home. The records hinted at a number of unexplained deaths within its walls, many attributed to a mysterious illness that swept through the hospital during its early years. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that the spirit of one of these patients, or perhaps the collective energy of them all, remained lingering in Oak Haven. The shadow, the rearranged tools, the unsettling scent, they were all attempts at communication, signs that something unseen was trying to make its presence known. I didn't quit my job. The need for the money outweighed my fear. Instead, I started leaving small offerings in the embalming room. A single white lily, a glass of water, even a handwritten note expressing my respect for the unseen presence. The disturbances didn't cease immediately, but they lessened in intensity. The flickering lights became less frequent, the tools less often rearranged. The shadowy figure in my visions remained, but the malevolence felt lessened, replaced by something akin to weary sadness. One evening, while working late, I heard a distinct tapping sound emanating from the far corner of the room. Hesitantly, I approached, my heart pounding in my chest. There, propped against the wall, was an old, tarnished silver locket. It was engraved with a single, faded initial. E. I picked it up. The locket felt strangely warm to the touch, emanating a faint, ethereal warmth that dispelled the usual chilling atmosphere of the room. Perhaps, I thought, it was a sign of peace, a token of acknowledgement from the unseen resident of Oak Haven Memorial. My work at the funeral home continued, but now it felt less like a job and more like a shared space, a silent pact between the living and the lingering spirits of the past. The lingering fear never quite left me, but it was slowly being replaced by a cautious, uneasy respect for the silent guardian of Oak Haven. I began working at a clothing store. Threads of Time, a quirky little boutique tucked away on a cobbled side street. Mostly vintage and reworked pieces, it had a certain je ne sais quoi that appealed to a specific clientele, the kind who appreciated a well-worn leather jacket or a hand-stitched scarf with a story behind it. My job, besides the usual retail duties, involved a peculiar task: dressing the mannequins. The mannequins themselves were unusual. Not the modern, sleek, almost human kind. These were older, more expressive, with slightly exaggerated features and a disconcerting realism about their painted eyes. I'd often found myself staring at them, even before the incident. They had a certain presence. My shift started at 6 a.m., an hour before opening. The store was quiet and still, the only sounds the low hum of the refrigerator in the back and the gentle clinking of wind chimes hanging near the entrance. My routine was simple: unpack new deliveries, steam wrinkled garments, and then, the piece de resistance, dressing the mannequins. That morning, the task seemed more daunting than usual. A particularly intricate outfit, a flowing emerald green gown with intricate beading, awaited its model, a tall, slender mannequin with a severe, almost haughty expression. I carefully draped the gown, smoothing out the fabric, adjusting the sleeves, tucking in stray threads. As I finished, I stepped back to admire my work. That's when it happened. The mannequin's head, impossibly, turned. It slowly, almost imperceptibly, rotated towards me. My breath hitched. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, a reflection, the result of too little sleep. "Must be tired," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. I walked to the other side of the display, arranging a stack of cashmere scarves. After a few minutes, I turned back, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. The mannequin was facing me again. This time, there was no room for doubt. The head was definitely turned towards me. Its painted eyes, a startling shade of blue, seemed focused. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't fatigue. It was something far more unsettling. I reasoned it was some kind of elaborate prank, a hidden mechanism, a cleverly designed illusion, but a part of me, a primal, instinctual part, knew it was more than that. I tried to act normally, carrying on with my duties, but the mannequin's gaze followed me, subtly, persistently. Every time I glanced at it, it seemed to be watching me, its painted lips twisted in what could have been a smirk or a grimace, depending on the angle. The unsettling feeling intensified as the morning progressed. I found myself avoiding eye contact, my movements becoming jerky and hurried. The other mannequins seemed to be watching too, their painted eyes following my every move like a silent, unnerving chorus. I confided in Sarah, my coworker and the only other person who worked at Threads of Time besides the owner, Mr. Silas, an eccentric man who preferred to remain mostly in his dimly lit office in the back. "Sarah, you won't believe what happened this morning," I began, nervously twisting a stray lock of hair. Sarah, a pragmatic woman with a dry wit, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The mannequins?" I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. "One of them, it turned its head." Sarah chuckled, a low, amused sound. "Oh, come on, Elara. It's just a mannequin." "But it did," I insisted. "I saw it. Twice. And it kept watching me." Sarah examined me, her expression softening. "You've been working late. Maybe you need a break." I knew she didn't believe me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The rest of the day passed in an unsettling haze. The mannequins seemed to loom, their painted eyes seeming to burrow into my soul. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the turning head haunted my dreams, morphing into grotesque shapes and shadows. I decided I needed to find out more. The next day, I arrived early, armed with a flashlight and a small tape recorder. I meticulously examined the mannequin, running my fingers over its painted surface, checking for hidden mechanisms, wires, anything that could explain its movement. I found nothing. Then I decided to test my theory. I placed the tape recorder near the mannequin and began asking questions, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you? Why are you doing this? What do you want?" I repeated the questions again and again, finally leaving the recorder running for several hours while I did my usual tasks. The silence on the recordings was unnerving, only the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator being audible. Days turned into weeks, and the unsettling occurrences continued. The mannequin's head turned more frequently, its movements becoming bolder. It seemed to have a malevolent intent, and the other mannequins seemed to be participating, their painted eyes fixated on me with a silent, threatening stare. One evening, after closing hours, I was alone tidying up when I finally discovered something. While dusting a shelf behind the mannequins, I found a small, worn leather-bound book with the title, "The Silent Watchers." There was a handwritten dedication in aged script. "For Silas." I cautiously opened it, turning the brittle pages. They were filled with cryptic entries and drawings, which I painstakingly decoded bit by bit over the next few days. The book described an ancient ritual, a way to imbue inanimate objects with a semblance of life, and the use of certain archaic spells. It further hinted at the mannequin's ability to feed off negative emotions, particularly fear. The truth was chilling. Mr. Silas, it seemed, wasn't just an eccentric shop owner, he was a practitioner of dark arts, and the mannequins were his creations, sentient, albeit limited, beings. Their movement was a result of his bizarre ritual, a ritual he'd probably performed on me, fueling the mannequins' life with my fear. The fear had given them power. That is, it was giving them more power. Armed with this knowledge, and filled with a surge of adrenaline, I made my decision. I couldn't continue working there, surrounded by those unsettling, malevolent eyes feeding their power. I quit my job at Threads of Time the very next day, leaving behind the haunting gaze of the mannequins and the chilling secret of Mr. Silas and his silent watchers. I never looked back, but I still sometimes wonder if I left the shop in time, or if the mannequins would someday find me again, with a hunger that was no longer just hunger but a terrifying bloodlust. The thought keeps me up at night. My first day as a night security guard at the Zenith Tower began with inspecting the elevators. The Zenith was a monolith of glass and steel, piercing the city skyline like a futuristic obelisk. My uniform, a crisp blue shirt and black trousers, felt oddly formal for a job that, according to Mr. Henderson, the surly day manager, mostly involved sitting around and making sure nobody steals the potted plants. But I was determined to prove him wrong. I was a responsible man, and I took my responsibilities seriously. The elevator bank hummed with a low, mechanical thrum. There were 5 elevators in total, each gleaming stainless steel, reflecting the fluorescent light with an almost unnerving intensity. I decided to start with the one closest to the security desk. I stepped inside, the doors closing smoothly behind me with a soft, almost sensual whoosh. I pressed the button for the 10th floor, a randomly chosen level. The elevator ascended, the gentle upward movement a stark contrast to the nervous flutter in my stomach. Then the drop. It wasn't a free fall, not exactly. More of a sudden lurch, a stomach-churning descent that felt far too abrupt for a normal elevator malfunction. 2 floors we plummeted, from the ground floor to the basement level, before grinding to a jarring halt. The lights flickered, bathing the small elevator cabin in brief, sporadic bursts of illumination, then plunged into near-total darkness. In those fleeting flashes of light I saw it. A figure crouched in the far corner, pressed against the wall as if trying to become one with the shadows. Pale, almost translucent, the figure seemed to be formed from the darkness itself. I couldn't make out any distinct features, only a vague sense of something hunched and still. The darkness returned, swallowing the figure whole, leaving me breathless and my heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight, thankfully clipped to my belt, was instantly in my hand. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the cramped space. The walls were bare metal, reflecting the beam back in a chaotic dance of light and shadow. The corner was empty. My breath hitched in my throat. Had I imagined it? Was it stress? Sleep deprivation? I was starting to doubt my sanity. The elevator was undeniably malfunctioning, but the figure, that felt too real, too visceral to be dismissed. I pressed the call button repeatedly. Silence. Then, a faint, high-pitched whine that sounded like tortured metal. The flickering lights grew more erratic, the darkness lasting longer between each flash. The air grew heavy, thick with a metallic scent and something else, something subtly acrid, like ozone and burnt toast. Panic began to claw at the edges of my composure. I was alone, trapped in a broken elevator in the bowels of a high-rise, haunted by a phantom figure, and a growing feeling that something was profoundly wrong. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, the light stabilized, casting a weak, sickly yellow glow. I checked the control panel. The numbers were all jumbled and flashing angrily. The emergency call button remained unresponsive. Then a voice, thin and reedy, echoed from the intercom. It was Mr. Henderson's voice, laced with an unusual urgency. "Security, this is Henderson. Are you down in the basement? Report your location immediately. We've had issues. There's been a power surge. Something's wrong with the elevators." I reported my situation, my voice trembling slightly. The relief of hearing his voice was immense, but it was swiftly replaced by a prickling unease. Issues wasn't the word he'd used before. The wait that followed was agonizing. Mr. Henderson's voice returned, sounding strained. Maintenance is on their way, but it might take some time. Stay put. And be careful. The "be careful" hung in the air, heavy with unspoken apprehension. The next hour was a blur of anxious waiting punctuated by the sporadic groans and clanks of the elevator mechanics. The pale figure was gone, but the oppressive atmosphere remained, clinging to me like a shroud. I found myself constantly glancing into the corners, half expecting to see it reappear. Finally, the doors burst open, revealing a team of maintenance workers, their faces grim, their eyes wide with something beyond simple concern. One of them, a man with grease-stained overalls and a haunted look, stared directly at me. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. He didn't press me for details. Instead, he helped me out of the elevator, murmuring something about a residual energy anomaly and a temporary disruption in the space-time continuum. Words that meant nothing to me, but the unnerving tone in which he spoke them spoke volumes. Back at the security desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, I tried to process what had happened. Mr. Henderson only offered a strained apology for the inconvenient malfunction. He made no mention of the pale figure, the strange smell, or the maintenance worker's cryptic words. He just handed me a new security checklist, the usual mundane tasks of checking fire exits and monitoring CCTV footage. But my first night at the Zenith Tower had already irrevocably altered my view of the mundane. The seemingly ordinary high-rise now felt infused with an unsettling energy, a latent darkness just beneath the surface. I was no longer merely a night security guard watching for petty thieves. I was a sentinel, guarding against something far more profound and terrifying, something that lurked in the shadows, between the floors, in the flickering lights and the metallic scent of fear. As the night wore on, the events of the elevator ride replayed in my mind, a silent film flickering behind my eyelids. Every creak of the building, every hum of the machinery, seemed to echo with the memory of that pale, silent figure lurking in the corner, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left undisturbed. And that my job, perhaps, was more significant than I had initially thought. The Zenith Tower was more than just a building. It was a gateway, and I was now its unwitting guardian,